members of the NICE. I now call this meeting to order.
Item A5, study session, and this will be on our state aid presentation by CFW. Dr. Morales.
I'd like to bring up our program partners, CFW. We have with us today Jeremy Cogan, Emilio Flores, and Greg back. The golfer. There you go. Greg Norman. Greg Norman.
Oh, I said the golfer. Oh, that's an odd last name, the golfer. Thank you. Oh, yeah, they gave us one. Yeah.
Which one has the right information?
Are they the same?
No.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
You're so used to the clicker.
I'm so, yeah, I know the routine.
Okay.
Good evening, President Morrison, members of the board, Dr. Morales. As we do periodically, CFW, at the request of the district, provides additional information regarding specific aspects of the district's facilities program. Today, we're here to update the board on the state aid program. As many of you know, back in 2016, voters in the state approved Proposition 51, approving $9 billion for K-14 improvements. About $7 billion was set aside for K-12, $3 billion for new modernization, $3 billion for new construction, $500 million for CTE, and $500 million for, I'm missing one. Charter schools, thank you. And as part of that program, the state has begun to resurrect the state aid program. The State Allocation Board, OPSC, as well as the governor's office has started to actually move projects through that particular process. What we want to do today is provide you an update of where we are in that process, where the state is in terms of issuing its bonds and providing funds to school districts, and additionally the anticipated applications that we see that's already been received by the state pending approval, and also future applications that will also be presented to the state for approval. So with that, I want to hand it over to Jeremy to walk us through where we are in terms of the Master Construct program.
Thank you and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here again with the CFW team. What I'm going to do starting out is just to describe really the connection between the Master Construct program and the state's school facilities program. You'll hear I'm going to do my best throughout the presentation. I think all of us are going to do our best to try to decomplicate the alphabet soup of acronyms that are likely to come up. And I'm going to try to train myself to say the full term instead of just the acronym, but if I mess up, just jump in and I'll make sure to explain. We want to start out by talking about the program. And when we say the program, we're referring to, of course, to the Master Construct and Implementation Program. There, of course, have been many iterations of this as it's been developed. The most recent integrated package was approved by the board in January of this year, and then was updated once again in June, what we call our 6-month or semi-annual report. So that's an integrated package of projects that look at addressing facilities needs throughout the school district with Measure D and Measure R funds, as well as other local sources, and leverage state sources of funds wherever possible. And those state funds that are being leveraged are most generally through the school facilities program. You'll sometimes see it referred to as SFP for short, but the shorthand we like to use is state aid. And that's the state's official program that was established through passage of propositions in the past. If you go even further back in time, and Greg can tell you the history going back to many early days, it's had its roots in the Leroy F. Green School Facilities Program, if you recall that term. But more recently, it's the School Facilities Program, and most recently, Proposition 51, which voters had the opportunity to vote on in November of 2016, was passed by voters which authorized the sale of additional bonds, which we'll get into in a moment. What I want to do first is describe an element of the Master Construct program, which was included from the very early, very initial planning process that was done with the board and the district, which was a concept of layering the level of improvements, layering the level of ability to leverage state funds based on how we would be able to take advantage of that state program. And I'm going to read from the bottom of the page on the presentation behind me, starting with basic. And you can kind of see there basic. The colors may be hard to see, but it's sort of an orange. That's really the core of the program. And at that core of the program with what we call the basic program, that was the portion of the program that was dependent on 100% local funds. Often we would refer to this as the program as it would exist if the state did not pass, if voters did not pass Proposition 51 in November. We used to have conversations, in fact, in front of the board saying, if voters fail to approve Prop 51, this is the environment we're going to have to operate under, the basic environment. And under that environment, 100% of projects are being paid for by local funds, and there is no match available from the state for any project. We definitely wanted to always have our plan A, B, and C with the knowledge that if no state monies were available, or in the circumstance where state monies were significantly delayed, there would be a program that could be funded with local dollars. The extended program was the next tier above that. And what the extended program did is it started to take advantage of state and local funds where there is a 50-50 match. And under that extended program, a project that was eligible for state new construction grants, you could have for every dollar, 50 cents on the dollar would come from local funds, 50 cents on the dollar would come from state funds, because there would be that 50-50 match using the new construction program from the state. The highest level, the highest tier, and sort of you're seeing the outer edge of this core, is the enhanced program. And that's your blue circle on the left. That is a portion of the program that the district may qualify for in the event that the district is given hardship status by the state. And we'll get into that a little bit more in terms of what financial hardship status specifically refers to. But under a hardship scenario, when a district qualifies for hardship from the state, that's a scenario in which programs are 100% funded by state funding and no local match is required. Or another way of putting it is the state is covering the local match on behalf of the district. Anything else you would add, Greg, on that basis? So what I want to do here is just briefly summarize for those watching, for those participating in the board meeting today. We're going to be referring often to new construction grants and modernization, and I want to summarize what those refer to. First, the new construction grant program. This is what I was referring to just a moment ago when I said a 50-50 match for new construction. Under that grant program, as it sounds, is designed to fund elements related to the new construction of school facilities. So it's the construction itself, plus it relates to the land acquisition, the design, the testing of the land that must happen for compliance with state agencies, inspection, and then furniture and equipment that ultimately goes into those spaces, and other costs that are related to the construction itself. The new construction grant program is a program that's calculated on a district-wide basis. So what the state will do when evaluating a district's eligibility for new construction grants is it will look at the entire enrollment in the district, and then it will compare that to the existing classroom capacity to house students in the district. The gap between those two becomes the eligibility of the district. And that eligibility is established at certain times, and we'll have a little bit more to share with you later in the presentation about how the state is looking for that eligibility to be established going forward. The second category is modernization grants. Modernization is a program in which the state provides 60% of the cost of improvements, and the local school district matches it with 40%. So you can imagine if I had to spend $1, we're going to put up 40 cents locally. The state will kick in their 60 cents for modernization. In the case of the modernization program, this is based on the age of school facilities, and it is specific to each school site. So unlike new construction, which is calculated on a district-wide basis, modernization, each school is examined as to the age of facilities at that school site. And the way the clock works with the state is the clock starts when a building is placed in service or when a building is modernized. And from that point, when a building hits 20 years of age, if it's a portable, or 25 years of age, if it's a permanent classroom, then it becomes eligible. So, for example, we would look at a school site, we'd say, here's the number of classrooms at this school site where it's been 25 years since its last modernization, or we can look at a portable and say, okay, that portable was installed back in 1997. It's now 20 years old in 2017. Okay, now that portable is eligible as well. That's the calculation for modernization. One note I'll make across the board here for both categories is the state, in many ways, looks at these scenarios in a ideal world where when they say, here's our 50% share, and you put in your 50% share, they're determining the cost of facilities that they think the facilities ought to cost. But if the actual cost of facilities exceed that, the local district picks up any remainder. So the state is saying, we're putting in 50% of the share, but it's not as if they look at the bill and they cut it in half and you pay 50-50. What actually occurs is they're determining a certain number of grants that the district is eligible for, and there's a value for each grant. And the value of the grant multiplied by the number of grants equals how much they contribute to the project.
I think the other thing I'd add to that is that the state also caps how many grants you can have per classroom. So what they use is their state loading standards to make that calculation on how many eligible students or how many pupil grants are you eligible for modernization. The other thing of note, I think Jeremy briefly touched upon this, is that while portable classrooms are considered in modernization, in the calculation for new construction, only permanent facilities, permanent classrooms are considered in that calculation. So while obviously while the district is providing desks and facilities for students in portable classrooms, the state does not recognize those as being part of that capacity calculation.
The last point I'll say here is in terms of grants, I mentioned that it's done on a basis of the total number of grants you're eligible for multiplied by the grant amount. As of 2017, the State Allocation Board, which is the entity responsible for determining the grant amount per pupil, has put in place for grades K through 6, each grant is worth approximately $11,104. For grades 7 through 8, each grant is worth approximately $11,744. Those are recalculated on an annual basis based on the state's analysis of inflation and construction costs using a standard index of construction costs throughout the state. But on the following pages, as we begin to go through the projects and the grant eligibility, it is those grant amounts that I just shared multiplied by the number of pupil grants that the project is eligible for.
And just before we get into this slide, one thing that I think is also very important for us to consider as well is that up to this point, the way in which the board and the district has approached the projects up to this point is we have prioritized projects that allow us to go back and leverage that state money. Although there was not a state bond prior to 2016, although there was limited funding available, what the district has done has been very diligent in applying for those funds, so that when money did become available, the programs were restored, that we'd be in line to go and try to get our fair share of that money. So what we're going to go into right now, and Jeremy will, and Greg will continue going through this particular slides, but we're going to go through first off the applications we've submitted on behalf of the district at this point that we're currently in line waiting for funding, as well as anticipated and pending applications to give the board a good picture of where we are and what we're trying to go after to help us get to that next level program beyond the basic level.
Let me just mention a few specific things that we're doing on behalf of the district as it relates to new construction. One of the components as to how we calculate what a district's eligibility is from a new construction baseline is any commercial or residential developments that are occurring in the district. So on behalf of the district, we are constantly in contact with the city to determine what sort of developments that they're doing within the school district boundaries. And we put together that information and submit it on behalf of the district to the Office of Public School Construction. To give you an example, if there is a 100-unit apartment complex being constructed within your school district boundaries, the student generation rate that the state uses is 0.5, so we can gather 50 students from that development. And even though that development may occur 5 years into the future, they're willing to give us new construction funds today in order to construct the classrooms to be able to educate those students. So even though we're in 2017 and say, for example, we get a track map from the city and they say, hey, we're going to develop this apartment complex in 2022. We can get you money for that today. So on behalf of the school district, we are constantly in contact with the city to determine what their developments are within the school district boundaries. The other thing that we do, and we have done, is we have a complete inventory of all of your classrooms within the district. And as Amelia was stating, those portable classrooms, the ones that we can eliminate from your baseline eligibility, gives you a higher new construction baseline eligibility. So that is a calculation that we definitely have done. And then each year, when your CalPads or your CBEDs come out in October, the first Wednesday in October, we gather that information from the administration. And what that does is there is what is called a cohort method that is used to weight what your enrollment is on a 5-year basis. And so we put that information into a formula and we submit that on behalf of the district to the state. So we are doing all of that work on behalf of the district in order to get you the highest new construction based on eligibility that you have. The other thing I would want to mention on the modernization, something that we're specifically doing here within the district, is that there's a component called like for like, which means that even though a particular school has generated modernization eligibility, either a 20 or 25-year basis, we can turn that modernization eligibility into new construction eligibility. So say, for example, you have a whole bunch of portables that you really don't want to modernize. We can say, okay, we're not going to modernize the portables. We can turn that into new construction eligibility. We can build you a new gymnasium, a new lunch shelter, a new classroom wing, whatever the case may be. And that is one of the techniques that we're also utilizing on behalf of the district. So just a few caveats as to the new construction and the modernization.
Okay, so with a little bit of introduction behind us, we want to spend the next few moments going over applications in various stages. And we're going to start with submitted applications, and the slide that follows will deal with other pending applications and future applications. But first, on the submitted applications, you're going to see a table behind me with columns for each project, and the very first row you're going to see says next step. And what we're referring to there, when you see this in any of the tables in this presentation, we're referring to really the next agency requirement that has to be met in order for those dollars to be received by the district. So in this case, all 6 of them say SAB, State Allocation Board. And the next agency requirement in the case of these 6 is that action be taken by the State Allocation Board to actually apportion the funds that have been applied for. Those projects, all 6 of these, are far enough along that they've met all the other prerequisites leading up to the State Allocation Board. And as we go further in this presentation, you're going to see there's quite a few prerequisites leading up to the State Allocation Board. But in these cases, all 6 of these have met every single prerequisite, and they are waiting for funding apportionment from the State Allocation Board. A little bit on what that means. Obviously, the state has to have funds available in order for the State Allocation Board to apportion funds. And we've all been holding our breath, not only since before Prop 51 was passed by voters, but after Prop 51 was passed by voters, holding our breath for signs and indications from the governor's office, from various state agencies, as to when and how those funds would be apportioned. And we're gonna provide further updates later in the presentation on exactly what we anticipate the state to be doing, and exactly what the latest news is on the bond sale by the state itself. But for summary's sake here, all 6 of these columns, you'll see that we are waiting for allocation apportionment by the State Allocation Board. I'll just briefly describe the projects. We have the first 2 that were part of our collection of improvements that we referred to as project number 1. At McAuliffe and Fremont, there was modernization eligibility for both of those that the district could leverage. Those projects are obviously now complete, but the ability to leverage the funds was taken advantage of, and applications were submitted. We did go through that process. So those are on the docket with the state. The third column, Driffle. The first point I want to make here, you'll notice a little asterisk next to the word Driffle, and a note below the table. What we want to make sure to remind the board and the community in the case of Driffle is that the numbers that are awaiting State Allocation Board action are in addition to the previous grant of $4.7 million new construction and $4.2 million facility hardship that CFW did process for the district in 2013. Those have already been processed and have been received. The item mentioned in the column for Driffle is what's being awaited from the state. Then we have the amount regarding the Seabridge land purchase, which is also on the docket. We have the Harrington project, which obviously the school was completed and all of the necessary prerequisites were met for state funding, but it is awaiting that SAB action. And then finally, Lemonwood, which is the most recent one to join this group. Obviously, that project remains under construction today, but its application has gone through all of the prerequisites, has been received by the Office of Public School Construction, and the Office of Public School Construction ultimately is responsible for processing applications for consideration by the State Allocation Board. One of the items that we will do our best to enlighten you all on is how the various lists are assembled by the Office of Public School Construction and the State Allocation Board. But that is where our submitted funding applications are today.
An important note about the current status of these applications is that up to this point, the district has upfronted the cost of construction on behalf of the state. And at this point, what we're doing is we're seeking reimbursement of the state's share for these projects. It's something that the state allows you to do, but when the program was initially contemplated, the idea would be that the state was walking hand in hand with you through the construction process, and so that you were expending dollars locally and the state was expending dollars from the state level hand in hand. That was the original design of the program. Given the lack of funding that the program experienced over the last few years, what's happened in this particular case is the district has actually upfronted the state's share, and now we're seeking reimbursement. So when these funds come back to the district, they will be going back and reimbursing the capital project fund. And so it's important to realize that at this stage, we are still seeking reimbursements for projects that we have already upfronted. As we move forward in the program, it is our hope and it is our expectation that the initial design of the program will come to fruition, and that will once again be partners in funding these facilities in the later phases of this particular program.
Just for clarification, what was the McAuliffe and the Fremont projects? Could you, because those are already done, correct?
Yes, those are done. At McCullough, there were improvements to the kindergarten classrooms to allow for an extended day kindergarten program. At Fremont, there were improvements to science labs.
Science labs, okay. Thank you.
So again, the next category is our pending funding applications. And again, the same format of the table where you see the next step. And what I'll point out is Elm and Marshall both share the same next step, which is an application being received by the Office of Public School Construction. What is required in both of these cases is the final application to be received by OPSC. It's met the prerequisites up to that point. And in both of these cases, there's a need to have a final determination of the costs as they will be covered under the state program for items that fall in addition to the work on the actual project. So let me try to explain that a little bit better. In both of these cases, in Elm and Marshall, we're building classroom buildings. Elm is an entire school, obviously, and Marshall is a classroom building being added to a school. But beyond those buildings themselves, there are other costs associated with the project, site work costs and off-site costs. And for both of these projects, we want to make sure that not only is the district being reimbursed for the share of the actual classroom construction, but for those ancillary costs around the site. So at Elm, it's the costs of the new buildings and the work around the site and the work to interconnect the site with existing utilities in the city of Oxnard. In the case of Marshall, it's the new building, and then it's the ancillary work around the new building to interconnect that building with the utilities on the Marshall site. So once those estimates are finalized by the design and construction team, then a complete application can be submitted to the Office of Public School Construction, and it, like Lemonwood, will then await processing by OPSC and action by the State Allocation Board. That's where those two projects are today. But the great news, obviously, in both of those cases is they've been approved by California Department of Education, so they have that final CDE letter of approval and all of the prerequisites that are required for that. In the case of the Harrington Early Child Development Center, it is pending its CDE application, and we expect that to go into the California Department of Education in the very near future. It will then follow in much the same way with an OPSC application based on the final costs. And I do notice we have an agenda item on the Early Child Development Center. So, for example, some of the items that come out of that conclusion will be used in the state aid application process. But those are the projects that are pending. We would say maybe on the 5 to 15 yard lines from getting into being part of that queue with the State Allocation Board.
And once again, these applications would be at reimbursements back to the district. Even with a couple more approval levels to go through, we do not anticipate that the state will have caught up to the demand for funds. So once again, these will also be reimbursements back into the district.
Just to summarize the totals, if you see the two yellow columns, the total pending is about $12.3 million. If we add that to the dollars we saw on the previous page, we're at a cumulative total of a little under $41 million in pending and submitted funding applications. Adding again to that, the Harrington Early Child Development Center brings that number to about $41.1 million. Finally, we'll summarize the remaining funding applications. And these are funding applications for projects that we've been directed to proceed on. The left-hand side starts with McKenna. We include Rose Avenue, the Doris Patterson Elementary School and Middle School project, as well as the Doris Patterson land acquisition, the Seabridge K-5 project, the kindergarten flex classrooms, which are actually 4 different projects at 4 different school sites, and the Fremont Gym Multipurpose Project. So There are 7 projects in this category, 6 if you're combining the land with Doris and Patterson. And you'll see, again, the next step category here. In these cases, these are projects that have not completed design. They're projects that are either just beginning the design process, or the design process in the case of Doris Patterson is still a bit away from getting going full steam. But in any of these cases, we obviously have the need to complete construction documents and have those documents be approved by the Division of the State Architect. And in addition to the Division of the State Architect approving the plans for these school sites, there are really 2 other major prerequisites that have to be met. The first is the school sites and the projects must be deemed compliant with the California Environmental Quality Act. And there's multiple ways that a project is compliant, but to put it succinctly, there is a document that's required for compliance, and different school sites require a different compliance document. In some cases, a compliance document may be what's called an environmental impact report. In other cases, there may be a lesser level of environmental compliance that's required. But in any case, there is some CEQA compliance document, California Environmental Quality Act compliance document, that is required. The second prerequisite we mention here is the Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC for short. And DTSC reviews the project, reviews the school sites for any potential contaminants or any potential materials that may be problematic for the construction of a school site. Typically, they go through a series of soils and other testing procedures. And on the very tail end of that process is what we all hope for, which is a letter from the DTSC that says no further action is required on this school site. Once a no further action letter is received, and once the Environmental Quality Act compliance document is in place, and DSA has approved the project, those 3 items allow the CDE consideration for approval to begin. We do start out very early in the process with CDE, with California Department of Education, and we sit down with their field representative to consider any of the elements of a project that might be of potential concern or interest to CDE later in their approval process. And so Greg Norman and myself and others from the CFW team will review those projects on an ongoing basis with CDE, and as well incorporate other feedback, district feedback from Mr. Fateh and others in the district staff. But ultimately, we have to complete the DSA approval process first, the CEQA compliance first, and the DTSC approval first, and only thereafter can a project be considered for approval by the California Department of Education.
So that means like the Rose Avenue, the Doris, all those other projects, they've already done the DSA, is that correct? And then they're in the second step?
So actually the opposite. No projects on this page have gone through DSA.
Okay, so just McKenna is at DSA.
McKenna is, I understand why you're asking the question now that I look at the table. The reason why for McKenna and for Seabridge we've listed DSA is that in both of those cases, the CEQA and DTSC steps have been completed. And so we are now ready to move toward DSA submission on those projects.
On which ones, I'm sorry?
On the McKenna project and the Seabridge project.
And Seabridge, okay. So then the others will have to go after the CEQA and after the DTSC.
Yes.
Then they go to DSA.
Yes, all the projects will go to DSA for the approval of the design of the project.
On page 8 in a future slide, there's a great graphic that goes through the timeline of everything in the sequence, like CEQA, DTSC, DSA, CDE, OPSC, and
Okay.
SAB.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a good flow chart there.
Okay. So in summary, for the remaining applications, there are a total of about $46 million of eligible pupil grants being utilized on these applications. If we take that 46.3 million and we add it to the pending and submitted applications, we come to an estimated grand total of approximately 87.5 million in state aid that would be either received or reimbursed to the district for these projects.
Moving on to the next page, what we want to do is give you an update of where the state is in funding the program. As we mentioned at the top of the presentation, Prop 51 was passed by voters in November of 2016. We are now 10 months past November, and the good news is that the state has started selling bonds to fund the projects that have submitted applications. Just last week, the state did sell bonds, a portion of it which are allocated for the school facilities program. They completed a sale of $800 million. This is of note because this is probably one of the smaller bond issuances the state has ever done. Typically, it's usually a billion, billion and a half, $2 billion chunks. Typically, they do it once a year in September. So in terms of the usual calendar of events for the state, it does line up with a bond issuance. However, the amount of funds that were issued and the allocation of funds for the school facilities program are much smaller than was hoped or anticipated. Approximately $443.6 million were allocated to the school facilities program from that bond sale. That is a little misleading just because the $443 million is not covering projects specifically for Prop 51. It's actually also covering some projects from the previous authorization. And so instead of, to give you some context, currently there is approximately $300 million in projects awaiting approval from the previous program. There's another 1.6 billion with a B project currently waiting in line for approval and apportionment. And so with this bond sale, what they are doing is they are addressing the needs from the previous program, and they're only addressing a partial amount of the need from the new program. So of the $9 billion, the $7 billion which are available for K-12 facilities, we're looking at approximately $200 to $300 million that are actually been apportioned out of that particular authorization to start funding the state program. But with that said, OPSC has begun to process the applications and make recommendations to the State Allocation Board. In fact, that first apportionment is occurring this evening at the state. They actually moved up their meeting from September 23rd to tonight, and the first allocations and apportionments will occur this evening. At this time, that first apportionment, we do not believe that the projects that we have gone through this evening will be part of that initial apportionment. But we do anticipate that over time they will be releasing more funds, and that we will be able to get the State Allocation Board will be giving apportionments to Oxnard for the projects that have already been submitted for. Like I said before, it was a little disappointing the amount of bonds the state has decided to allocate. This is truly at the sole discretion of the governor and the treasurer about the timing and the amount of sale bonds and how they want to apportion that. There is $1.6 billion in needs still remaining out there that needs to be addressed before even applications that we submit tomorrow or the day after that are considered. It was hoped by members of CASH and other districts that the apportionment would be closer to $1 billion, $2 billion, and that the timing of the bond sale would be accelerated in order to meet the demand that already exists. However, given the political climate that we find ourselves in, given the governor's specific perspective on the school facilities program and the state's debt, at this point in time, it is very clear that he is trying to prolong the issuance of those bonds. And at this time, school districts throughout the state are at its mercy in terms of making sure that those programs come forward. Hopefully, with a new, with us going into an election cycle coming up, some have theorized that it could be a bargaining chip for a potential candidate saying, you know, it's a very quick and easy win to release additional funding upon being elected to the governorship. Additionally, the governor may also be running out the clock until it's somebody else taking responsibility for that additional debt going forward. But this has impacted the program in terms of timing. State officials at this point have indicated that the plan going forward, they anticipate a bond sale occurring every 6 to 12 months. They anticipate, while the current administration is in office, that a similar amount or a like amount of bonds will be issued at each of those points. So we could be in a situation a year from now where either $1 billion total have been issued or $1.5 billion could be issued. In the best case scenario, where there's a $1.5 billion being issued, we would have cleared the majority of the backlog that has existed at the state since about 2012. So in terms of timing, in terms of where we stand today, it's important to recognize that all the projects that we have gone into design with today, there are identified funding sources to construct them. There are identified sources to build them. What may be affected is the timing of those based on the ability of based on the ability for the district to issue additional bonds or have receipts from the state in terms of those reimbursements that we talked about. Another important update on the administrative side of things is that OPSC, the Office of Public School Construction, remains terribly understaffed. Once upon a time, I think there were 5 directors and probably about 30 staff members that would process all these applications. Today, I believe there are 2 supervisors?
3 supervisors and
3 supervisors and 3 staff members responsible for all the applications that are coming to the state. As many of you know, like yourselves, there are a lot of successful school districts this past cycle. There is a flood of construction occurring in the state, and there's a flood of applications going in. So even at an administrative level, we're seeing some resistance to provide proper support to process those particular applications. CFW, as part of our continuing services, we actually go and attend. We send individuals to those SAB meetings to gather notes to understand what those legislative changes are. And I think one of the other important things about Proposition 51 is that although it had adopted and used the previous program as the foundation for the legislation, there is leeway for the governor, for the State Allocation Board, and for the Office of Public School Construction to modify the program, to tweak it in certain ways that also have effects on the school district's ability to either get reimbursed or to engage in that hand-to-hand relationship of getting funding. So with that, before I move on to Greg to explain some of the changes that we've had in the program since it being passed in November, are there any questions regarding the bond sale or anything else that we have discussed so far? Greg.
Like Emilio mentioned, there have been significant changes to the state program, what we refer to as the SFP, or Senate Bill 50, which is the framework for how Proposition 51 is to be administered. Probably the most significant change is that a grant agreement is now being required in order for a district to receive an apportionment from the State Allocation Board. And basically what the significance of that is that there were certain funding items that the SAB, the governor's office, and others felt that was not commensurate with a 30-year bond program. And basically what they were referring to was technology. They felt that the technology is changing at such a rapid pace that most technology is outdated within 2 to 3 years. And so their position was, why are we spending 30-year bond funds or purchasing 30-year bonds for items that will only last 2 to 3 years? So what they did was certain technology was therefore not put forth as an eligible expenditure going forward under Prop 51. So your computers, your printers, and things of that nature, in past apportionments, you would receive monies for them. But going forward, you will no longer be able to receive monies for certain types of technology. And of course, we're monitoring that, and we will be communicating that to the district.
And if I just may interject real quick, there is still some debate as whether or not that applies going forward in terms of the state saying, you know, in that hand-to-hand type of relationship, walking down into construction, or that applies in that case only, or in the case where we find ourselves in the reimbursement side of things. There are districts out there that have expended general fund money, which is obviously a lot more flexible. And whether or not those reimbursements will be subject to that grant agreement going forward as well. And that's something that is still being ironed out at the state. And obviously, there's a number of districts, though it's not the case in Oxnard, but there are a number of districts that are out there trying to make their case and saying, look, we spent very flexible money to cover your share. We want to make sure that whatever money you give back to us, that our hands aren't tied, and that we're able to fully reimburse the district for that opportunity cost.
So going forward, in addition to what we commonly refer to as 5004, which is a funding request, we will then have the superintendent or the CBO to sign this grant agreement, which is an acknowledgement to the state of the changes going forward. So that will be an additional document that would require the district authorization and acknowledgement. The other major thing is that, and this is coming directly from the governor's office, is that they want an audit. They wanted some significant changes to how the program was being audited. And so what they did was they made it part of the normal everyday audit, annual audit that a district undergoes. So when you do your annual audit, any funds that you have received from the state will have to be part of that audit. And so your local auditor will now start to include your SFP, your school facility program projects, on their annual audit by the district. Okay. The other change, which is the financial hardship component, we have touched briefly upon that, and it has been explained that this is basically where the state picks up the district local match. Right now, they are undergoing some revisions to the application that is required in order to make a request for financial hardship. It's currently at the Office of Administrative Law. And so what the state is allowing districts to do is to go ahead and submit an application without actually having your financial hardship status confirmed. In previous years, your financial hardship status had to be confirmed before you could request an apportionment under financial hardship. So that is a little bit of a benefit, and they acknowledge that a lot of districts will need financial hardship, so they're allowing you to place your application in line and then at a later point in time certify that you do meet the criteria for financial hardship. Just so you are aware, most districts qualify for financial hardship because they have a bonding capacity that exceed your debt capacity exceeds 60% of your bonding capacity. That's how most districts would qualify under the current regulations for financial hardship status. Another way that districts do qualify is if they attempted a local bond and that local bond failed within 2 years, then you would also qualify for financial hardship. There's 5 different ways that you can qualify for financial hardship. In the case of our district here, it would be the 60% bonded indebtedness limit. Probably the most significant thing that the state is doing, and this is still open for discussion, debate, and actually a lawsuit, is that the OPSC is requiring that a district that is seeking new construction apportionment, that they update their baseline, their new construction baseline eligibility at the time that your application is being considered. The significance of this is a lot of districts have their baseline, and they may have established their baseline 10, 15 years ago. And during that time period, they have experienced declining enrollment, and so the need is no longer there, but their new construction eligibility is still on the books. And so we have these districts getting new construction funds where there's really not a need. The OPSC had identified this as one of the areas that they wanted to change. As a matter of fact, back in January of 2014, the State Allocation Board commissioned a review panel of its members to review the school facilities program, and that was one of the most significant things that they wanted to change. And so going forward, what we would do, and this would have an impact here at our district, is that when one of our applications comes forth that we are requesting a new construction apportionment, we will then have to prepare what your eligibility is at that particular point in time. So we will submit that information on your behalf. So if there's a dip in our enrollment or projections, then that could somewhat affect us, or if there's an increase, then obviously that would be to our benefit. So this is something that CASH has dug its heels in, the Coalition for Adequate School Housing, and they have sought a remedy from the Office of Administrative Law in regards, because they think that this is not legal, that the regulatory procedures were not adhered to, and so therefore they believe that this is not a legal thing that the OPSC is doing. The result or the opinion from the OAL is due here in September, so we should know within the next week or two whether or not this is going to go forward or whether or not they're going to rescind it.
And once again, this is going to put, if this does go forward, it'll put even more pressure on that CalPED's, CBED's data. And I suspect what you'll see is school districts trying to line up their applications so it's either right before or right after that announcement. So if you have an increase in enrollment, you want to wait till after that number comes out. But if you anticipate having decline, I suspect school districts will be smart enough to rush it in there before those numbers become public. So it's going to be interesting to see if it does move forward, how it's implemented, because obviously school districts are extremely resourceful, and they will find a way to make sure it works to their best advantage wherever possible.
Absolutely. The other change that the OPSC is doing is that they are really, from an administrative perspective, they are going to the letter of the law as it relates to land acquisition. In times past, what they would allow a school district to do, as long as you acknowledge the number of pupils that were going to be going into a particular school site, they would allow you to go ahead and get a separate apportionment for the land which was going to house any new school development. What they're basically doing now is they're still giving the money for the land apportionment, is that they're also now requiring that the project have DSA approval as well before they will give you the apportionment. So what we're doing in order to address this slight nuance change is that on our projects that we are acquiring land to build our new school facilities, we will also be submitting at that time the DSA approved plans for construction apportionment as well. And basically what this is a result of is that school districts, unfortunately, in the past have gone out, acquired property, and never built a school on it. And unfortunately...
Or flip them.
Or flip them, or whatever the case may be. So the OPSC may be slow, but they're not that slow. So if they see a trend developing where certain districts are, or a number of districts are taking advantage of either the financial hardship or acquisition of property or charter schools or whatever the case may be, they will eventually try to close that loophole.
And all these changes have intended and unintended consequences. One thing that I think is very important to note on the bottom of that page is that last change may affect an application the district had already submitted, and that's the reimbursement for the acquisition of Seabridge. And so it's unclear at this point whether or not they're going to honor the fact that they've already approved it, it was already in line, and they'll apply, will be grandfathered into the apportionment, or the other outcome could be that they kick us out and they say you come back when you have DSA approved plans. Now, good news is that we've started moving down that path to design, But in parallel to that, I can tell you right now that I believe that it has to be a very strong case to pull us out. And I don't think that anybody involved in that particular process would go down without a fight of keeping it there, because it was already approved, it's sitting on the list, it's waiting quite literally for funds to be poured into the program. And so, Oxnard's not the only person or only district that's in that particular situation as well. So that is something of consequence. That is something that you need to be aware about, that change may affect the timing of that reimbursement for Seabridge. Good news is that we are approaching it on many different paths, as we're known for Plan A, B, C, and D. Obviously, A is to get our money that was promised to us, but B is that we have started the design process, and hopefully we can mitigate any of that delay, or even make a case to reserve our spot in there. So there are many things that we're exploring on that side, and there are actions that will continue to come to the board where necessary and discuss with staff. But it is important for you to understand that change may affect the timing of when we get reimbursement from the state for Seabridge, regardless of the fact that they've already approved and recommended us for apportionment.
So the only other change that has occurred is that, if you recall, all of the projects that we submitted when the state was without bonding authority, they put those projects on what was called then the acknowledged list. All of the projects from the district that was on the acknowledged list are now on the workload list. So they are in line as to the date order received, and when their date comes up, based upon the staffing there, then they will be processed.
Okay, so now that we've gone through a lot of detail, a lot of information, a lot of acronyms, this is the part where I'm going to give you the cheat sheet for the test, okay? And when I was in school, my favorite teachers were the teachers who would say, you know what? Robin, those were my favorite, yeah. But beyond that, it was the teachers that said, look, put on a 3x5 card your notes, and the night before put on a 3x5 card and bring that 3x5 card with you. So if you were studying for the test, you would want to put the chart on the right on your 3x5 card. And what that consists of is really from top down the process that we go through with all of the various agencies and compliance before the State Allocation Board will be ready to approve a funding apportionment. So I'll briefly review. We've covered some of this already, but just to kind of see if we can visualize the process. When a project begins, one of the early things we do, and you see it on your board agendas when they come up for board approval on often the consent calendar, is we bring on consultants who are going to study the project for compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. And like I mentioned earlier, there are various levels of compliance documents. There are many projects that the district undertakes that once that study completes, the study concludes that the district is exempt from CEQA. Projects are exempt from CEQA when they consist of minor additions to existing schools, or when they consist of replacement of school buildings with structurally, seismically better replacements. So when you're taking an old school built in the 50s and 60s and 70s and you're replacing those school buildings with seismically enhanced new buildings, that's one of the categories that often is looked at for exemption, as well as minor additions to existing school sites. There's a number of different exemptions, more than a dozen different exemptions that are evaluated. But ultimately, projects might be exempt from CEQA, in which case the compliance document is called a notice of exemption. In some cases, the compliance document is a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration, and then some projects require what's called an environmental impact report, which is really the full-blown report. In any of those cases, we go through that process. We make sure that the compliance with CEQA is undertaken. The next one you see down from that is DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substances Control. And what they are, again, responsible for is evaluating any potential hazards on a school site. And you'll see there's a note here, unless CEQA exemption. So I mentioned earlier that many projects are exempt from CEQA. And there are cases where, because you're exempt from CEQA, the California Department of Education doesn't require any preliminary action by the DTSC. They realize and recognize that a project might be a minor addition to an existing site, a site that's always been used, for example, as a school site, and it doesn't require that further level of DTSC examination. As we're going through the process and as consultants are looking at CEQA and DTSC compliance, at the very same time that that's happening, usually you have architects on board, and those architects are chugging along through the process to develop the final construction documents for the school sites. And as the board may recall, we've had several presentations these last 6 months by architects presenting their conceptual designs of projects. And once they presented those conceptual designs to the board, they get hard at work on the various levels of development for the actual construction drawings. What DSA does when plans are submitted to DSA is DSA reviews all of the plans submitted, and there are really 3 priority areas DSA looks at. In fact, each area has its own team of reviewers within DSA, its own department of reviewers. And the first is structural. They're looking at the structural seismic ability of the buildings. Much of this harkens back to the original establishment of DSA and those policies after the Field Act, which was resulting from the Long Beach earthquake many decades ago. There's also a fire life safety review that occurs with DSA. It is as it sounds. They're looking at making sure the buildings are designed with safety and fire and life codes being met. Finally, there's an accessibility review. This is very much taking into account requirements by the Americans with Disabilities Act and other acts and codes that require our buildings to be accessible for all persons. And so those 3 reviews are undertaken at DSA. Once the DSA approves plans, then a letter is sent from the state saying that these plans are approved for further construction. And that is the time at which the California Department of Education will be willing to consider approving a project. There's a preliminary approval, an early stage where they'll look at a project early on before, but final approval cannot take place until these first 3 categories, CEQA, DTSC, and DSA, have all met the necessary requirements. So a project then does go into to review by the California Department of Education. They verify that the plans are consistent with Title V of the Ed Code. And Title V, in many ways, is the state's way of saying that if we're going to fund a project, if the state is going to contribute its share of funding, we want to see that many common issues that we see with schools are addressed, and that we don't run into any issues where schools are designed in such a way that would be detrimental to a good educational program being in place in those schools. A classic example might be that CDE might look at a building and say, you know what, you have a building where one room is a library and the next room right next door is the band room where the marching band is going to be practicing for 3 hours a day, and how can you have that right next to your library? Obviously that's not the case in any of our projects, but those are things that CDE would say, okay, is the project as it's designed consistent with the requirements for project design under Title V of Ed Code? Assuming that a project meets those requirements, it's met the prerequisites, and there aren't any remaining questions to be addressed by CDE, we all look eagerly into our mailbox for a letter from Fred Yeager, who is up at the California Department of Education offices in Sacramento for approval on the project. And once that's in place, the CFW team, working again hand in hand with the district in this, begins assembling all of the necessary documents for an application to the Office of Public School Construction. Their job, like the jobs of these other prior prerequisites, is to verify that everything's in place, you've met your DSA approval, you have your CDE approval, and ultimately to process the application for eventual consideration by the State Allocation Board, which is the last step in the process, which then takes its action when, as Greg mentioned, the grant agreement is in place, other items are in place, and the state has funding, as Emilio described in his report, to actually make the apportionment. So that is, in a nutshell, your cheat sheet before the test. I hope you all put it on your 3x5 cards and have it if you can't sleep.
Thank you very much. An excellent report. Any questions before we? Thank you. A lot of information. Very well done.
Yeah, I know we don't get a chance to hear about the nooks and crannies of state aid, but I do want to commend Greg Norman, the magic behind the machine, and in state aid, and to remind the public as well as the board, you know, in regards to state aid, CFW is doing an exceptional job for the district. Every single program possible that the district is eligible for, we have an application for. So we're definitely prepared for what's currently getting funded and what's anticipated to be funded, and it's very well done. So good job, guys.
Thank you.
Okay.